Who is inside my house? I was not supposed to see this.
If he signs the documents, everything is finished.
That was always the plan. What documents?
There is something wrong, isn't there?
What did you find? I never signed this.
What did he leave behind?
He knew something was wrong. He tried to warn them.
You should have taken the flight. That canceled flight saved more than my life.
You were never supposed to see me come back.
The night his flight was canceled, Elias Grant went home without calling ahead. He did not expect the black Maybach in his driveway, engine still warm in the rain, no plates he recognized and no explanation he could reach. The front door was unlocked. From the study he heard Marin's voice, deliberate and low, aimed at someone she trusted. Through the doorframe he saw his wife across from a man in a dark suit, and between them lay his passport, sealed company documents, and a photograph of his brother Terrence, dead 4 years now. The stranger turned around, pale-faced. "You weren't supposed to come home early. If a canceled flight can save a life, stay close." What Elias brought home that night changes everything. Elias Grant had spent 11 years building the kind of professional reputation that companies like Whitmore Aeronautics spent millions trying to manufacture from the outside. The reputation of a man who found problems before they became consequences, who applied his training without shortcuts, and who had never in his career signed his name to something he had not personally verified. The assignment that arrived on a Thursday afternoon was framed as an opportunity. A week in Paris to certify a new vendor and close a compliance report before Whitmore's European partnership moved into its final phase, the kind of task a senior safety engineer was expected to handle without complaint. And Elias had handled 100 variations of it in 11 years without complaint. But the specific assembly of this one, the urgency with which it had been scheduled, the personal call from Preston Whitmore emphasizing the trip was not optional. The follow-up from Gavin Rourke specifying that Elias should leave his personal laptop at home, and that all documentation would be pre-formatted and waiting at the Paris hotel, did not hold up to examination the way a routine assignment should, and Elias spent the drive to Belhaven International, cataloging those inconsistencies the way he cataloged mechanical tolerances, quietly, without expression, waiting for the pattern to tell him what it meant. The return ticket had not been confirmed at booking, which had never happened in 11 years of international travel for the company, and when Elias asked about it, Gavin's assistant told him twice that the return would be arranged at the Paris end, a policy that did not exist anywhere in the company's travel manual. Preston called again the evening before departure and used the phrase, "The Whitmore family needs this from you," which was a form of pressure Elias recognized immediately. Warmth deployed in place of argument, the language that worked best on people who still believed in the institution asking them. He had said the right things and gotten off the phone, and he had been sitting in the departure lounge, still trying to resolve the feeling that the numbers did not add up when the storm front rolled across the eastern seaboard and blinked his flight into a red cancellation at 9:47 in the evening. The airline put him in a voucher line, and Whitmore's travel desk called within 4 minutes with a hotel confirmation already in his inbox. Fast enough that Elias understood, standing there with his bag at his feet, and the announcement still echoing across the terminal, that someone had been watching the departures board in real time. He did not go to the hotel, and instead stood in the terminal for several minutes, thinking carefully about the speed of that reservation before he walked to ground transportation and got into a cab without calling Marin, because he wanted the small gift of her face when he opened the door, the ordinary pleasure of a surprise return after a week away, before another absence put more distance between himself and the life he was supposed to be coming home to. The cab turned onto his street at 11:23, and the first thing Elias saw was the Maybach. Midnight black Virginia plates, parked directly in his driveway with engine heat still shimmering from the hood despite the steady rain falling across the neighborhood, a car he had never seen parked here and had no immediate way to account for. He asked the driver to stop at the curb and did not open the door right away. He sat in the back seat for a full minute, watching the light through the curtains of his study window, which was lit in the amber way it lit when Marin was working late. But the shadow of a second figure moved behind the curtain, and Elias watched it for a moment longer before he paid the fare and stepped out onto the wet curb. He walked toward the front door with his key already in his hand, moving with the quiet of a man who has spent his career listening for the sounds a system makes when something inside it has begun to fail. Elias entered the house without announcing himself, moving through the dark hallway the way he sometimes moved, through a problem he needed to understand before he committed himself to being part of it. The study door was 3/4 open, the way Marin left it when she was working late and wanted the rest of the house to feel connected to her. And from the hallway he heard her voice before he reached the frame, low and careful, the particular register she used with clients she had not yet decided to fully trust, giving information without giving access. He heard her say, "If Elias signs those documents in Paris, there is nothing left to dispute afterward. The liability transfers completely, and everything Whitmore needs closes on his signature alone." He heard a man's voice answer, "That's exactly what Rourke designed the trip for." Elias stepped into the doorframe and looked at the scene with the stillness he applied to any reading that came back wrong. His own passport open on the desk between them, a sealed Whitmore document packet beside it, and in the frame a photograph of Terence that he had not seen in 2 years, that he had certainly not left in this room. The man across from Marin was in his mid-40s, dressed in charcoal wool that announced money without requiring it to be spoken. And his face when he turned and saw Elias standing there was the face of a calculation that had just encountered a variable it had not accounted for. He asked them both to sit down and tell him what he was looking at. The man's name was Julian Cross, and Elias recognized it from the organizational charts he had studied during his first year at the company. General Counsel, departed 3 years earlier under a summary that circulated through the office as a health exit, quiet and unquestioned, the kind of departure large organizations arrange when they need a person gone, but prefer the reason to remain unexamined. Julian said he had not left for health reasons. He said he had been removed after formally objecting to the terms of a settlement agreement executed in the weeks following Terence Grant's accident. An agreement that contained binding non-disclosure language covering the technical circumstances of the crash, and that had been signed, among others, by Julian himself, at a point in his professional life when self-preservation had outweighed the alternative. He said Marin had reached out to him 6 weeks earlier, after she found anomalies in the records of an aviation insurance fund she had been retained to audit, and that they had met 3 times in total, with documentation as the stated and actual purpose of each meeting, and nothing else as the context. Elias looked at Marin, and she held his eyes without looking away, and he knew, with the same certainty he applied to structural tolerances and load calculations, that whatever she had done, infidelity in the sense that had formed as a possibility for one unguarded moment was not part of it. What she had done was investigate the company, the money, and the death that had defined the last 4 years of both their lives. And she had done it without telling him, and that was its own kind of breach, quieter and more specific, but not a light one. Julian placed a document in front of Elias, a compliance report dated 14 weeks earlier, bearing Elias's electronic signature on the authorization line, certifying receipt and approval of a controlled component shipment from a company named Northstar Dynamics. Elias read the date twice. 14 weeks ago he had been in a surgical recovery ward, his right knee immobilized and elevated, with a hospital identification bracelet on his wrist, and 11 consecutive days of company communications unanswered, because his physician had ordered him completely off work terminals. He set the document down and did not say anything for a long moment, because the first and most important thing, in his professional experience, and in this moment equally, was to understand precisely what had been done, before deciding what to do about it. The signature was exact in all the ways that mattered for a forgery to survive. Not a scan of an old document repositioned, not an approximation, but a precise replication of the digital certificate his credentials generated automatically, matching the timestamp format, the embedded metadata string, and the sequential authorization number in a manner that would pass automated verification and survive manual review, because it had been produced by someone with access to his credential architecture and sufficient time to test the output before committing it to a document that would become part of a permanent record. He studied it at the desk while Julian and Marin waited, and what he felt was not panic but the particular stillness that precedes careful analysis. The discipline of not moving until the reason a number is wrong has been established, before deciding what to do about the wrongness. The report certified that a shipment of flight control actuators from Northstar Dynamics had been received, inspected against Whitmore's internal safety specifications, and approved as flight-ready for integration into the current production series, and the approving engineer of record was identified by name and certification number and electronic signature as Elias Grant, Chief Safety Engineer, and not one item in that description was true. He had never reviewed a component from Northstar Dynamics. He had never encountered the company's name in any professional context before that evening in his own study. Marin laid out what she had found in the sequence she had found it, the way she always presented an audit trail. Starting with the anomaly and moving backward toward the source, because that was the direction in which fraudulent structures revealed themselves most completely. She had first encountered Northstar Dynamics as a payee in the ledger of the Aviation Insurance Fund, and when she traced the payments in both directions, she found an architecture built specifically for movement and concealment, money flowing from Whitmore subsidiary accounts into Northstar, then fracturing across 3 holding companies before consolidating in a Delaware-registered private investment vehicle controlled, through nominee directors, by Gavin Rourke. The amounts were not modest. The arrangement had been operational for at least 4 years, and the volume of components that had moved through Northstar's paperwork into Whitmore's certified inventory over that period was large enough that a full remediation would require grounding every aircraft currently flying actuators traceable to that supply chain. There were 17 of those aircraft already in active commercial service across 3 regional carriers, Marin said, and she had not told Elias sooner because Julian had argued. And she had accepted the argument that Elias's company issued phone and laptop-generated server logs that Gavin's department could access without a judicial order, and that a call to Elias on a monitored line would have given Whitmore advance notice before the evidence was complete enough to withstand the response. Elias told Marin, plainly and without raising his voice, that the reasoning was sound, and that he did not accept the conclusion she had drawn from it. He said she had made a decision about his exposure, about what risks he was permitted to take and when, and that the decision was not hers to hold on his behalf, that a marriage was not a structure in which one person managed the danger and kept the other comfortable inside it, and that the protection she had been trying to extend was something he could not accept, because accepting it had cost him the right to choose. Marin did not defend the choice as correct. She said she had been afraid of a specific thing, watching Elias do again what he had done after Terrence died. The 8 months of technical inquiries and formal requests and closed doors, and then the particular way he had eventually stopped. Not because the question was resolved, but because the cost of continuing had become more than he could absorb and still be present in the life they were building together. Julian then told them what the Paris trip had been designed to accomplish. The document Elias would have signed in France was the capstone of the entire structure, the master certification binding all previous approvals, including the forged ones, into a single safety chain bearing Elias's professional authority, so that if a failure occurred in service, the liability architecture would point at the engineer whose name appeared on the record rather than the executive who had sourced the parts or the operating officer who had taken the profit. The metal toolbox had been in the corner of the garage for 4 years, pushed against the wall behind a shelving unit under a moving blanket, because Elias had not been able to open it after the funeral and had not been able to throw it away, and it had occupied the specific category of things that a person leaves undisturbed because disturbing them requires deciding what they mean, and for 4 years he had not been ready to make that decision. Terrence had sent it to the house 2 days before the test flight, with a text message that said only, "Hold on to this for me, I'll explain when I'm back." When Terrence did not come back, the box became the physical form of a conversation that would never happen, and Elias had kept it, because keeping it was the only available substitute for the conversation itself. He had not touched it again until 3 weeks ago, when Marin was reorganizing the garage and noticed that the floor of the box was heavier than a standard set of hand tools had any reason to be. The false bottom was machine-fitted aluminum with a recessed latch disguised as a rivet. The modification of a man who built things for precision, who had apparently concluded that the people above him were monitoring his communications, and that the only genuinely secure place for something important was inside something that looked like it held nothing important at all. Inside the compartment, Terrence had placed a spiral notebook, a sealed anti-static pouch containing a compact memory card, a set of photographs printed from a facility that did not use Whitmore's printers, and a single disassembled flight control actuator from the same component class as those appearing under Elias's forged signatures. But this particular unit had been carefully examined before being stored, and the examination had left marks. Elias held the actuator under the garage light and turned it slowly at a shallow angle, and what he saw was what he would have expected to see if someone had ground down the original manufacturer's markings on the housing and replaced them with a stamped serial number from a certified supplier, done precisely enough to survive visual inspection on a busy hangar floor, and not precisely enough to survive the kind of physical measurement that a chief safety engineer would apply if he had a reason to look closely. The notebook was written in Terrence's compressed, economical handwriting and tracked a series of component tests across 6 weeks. Serial numbers, operating temperatures, and duration readings in columns that told their story plainly. The actuators performed within specification on tests under 40 minutes and exceeded their thermal safety ceiling during extended operation, climbing past acceptable limits during precisely the conditions that a commercial approach and landing sequence would create. The final entry was dated 4 days before the accident and read simply, "Took the primary unit. Sent everything I had to legal. Waiting." Julian confirmed what the notebook described. He said Terrence had delivered the documentation by hand to the Whitmore legal department, that Julian had received it personally, and that he had forwarded it to Preston Whitmore with a formal cover note recommending immediate suspension of the test program pending independent review. Preston had thanked him by email and said the engineering team had already reviewed the concerns and found them non-critical. And 3 days later, Terrence had taken off in a test aircraft carrying actuators from the same supply chain, and the day after the memorial service, every actuator in that aircraft had been replaced with a different component before the accident investigation team was permitted access to the hangar. The memory card, played on a protected drive Marin kept for forensic work, contained 40 seconds of audio recorded in what sounded like a hangar at night. Ambient machinery, distant ventilation. And Terrence's voice was the voice of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was speaking past the outcome he feared toward the specific person he wanted to reach. If Elias is hearing this, it means they decided profit was worth more than the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to explain it myself. The phone rang at 12:41 in the morning. The name on the screen was Preston Whitmore, and Elias allowed it to ring twice before he answered. 2 rings in which he made the decision to perform the version of himself that Preston expected to find on the other end. Cooperative, grateful, reassured by the institution he had given 11 years to, and with no evident reason to believe it was using him as the signature line on a long-running fraud. Preston opened with warmth, asking about the airport hotel, expressing appropriate concern about the storm delay, informing Elias that a private charter had been arranged for 6 the following morning. Paris by afternoon. Documentation waiting at the hotel. Nothing to worry about on the logistics end. Elias said he was settled and grateful, and would be at the airfield by 5:45. He asked, as casually as his training allowed, for some background on North Star Dynamics before the meeting. He had seen the name in a preliminary summary and liked to be prepared before vendor reviews, and he wondered if Gavin's office could send him a brief overview by morning. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, and it was not the silence of a man searching for a name in his memory. It was the silence of a man who had just heard a question and was calculating precisely what the person asking it already knew. And when Preston spoke again, the warmth in his voice was technically intact, and the cadence beneath it had shifted in a way that Elias, who had spent 11 years learning to hear what systems were actually doing below their surface readings, heard with complete clarity. Preston said North Star was a secondary procurement vendor, one of several the operations team had vetted and approved, nothing requiring special preparation on Elias's part, and he ended the call shortly after. Elias set the phone on the counter, and before any of them could speak, the home security panel chimed a single alert. Attempted access via a keypad code that had not been active in 18 months, a code assigned by Whitmore's facilities department during a home office security survey, and never formally disclosed to Elias as something the company retained. At 12:58, 17 minutes after the call ended, a formal legal notice arrived at Elias's personal email from a Whitmore outside counsel firm. Demand for immediate return of all proprietary materials, citation of unauthorized trade secret retention, and advisement that non-compliance would result in civil and criminal referral. Julian read it over Elias's shoulder and said that 17 minutes told them almost everything they needed to know about how closely the phone call had been monitored and how ready the response had been. Marin suggested contacting Naomi Hartley, the federal investigator who had been assigned to Terrence's accident before the file was transferred to a state board and eventually closed. Naomi answered at 1 in the morning without apparent surprise, said she had been expecting something like this conversation for nearly 3 years, and ended the call by saying that what they had described was compelling, that compelling and sufficient were 2 different standards, and that she would need evidence capable of surviving a defense team funded by a corporation with a 9-figure legal budget before she could act. They argued in the kitchen after Julian stepped outside to make a call. And the argument was not about the Maybach or the man who had arrived in it, or any of the subjects a person might expect to find at the center of a marriage in the kind of crisis this one had become overnight. Elias sat at the table and told Marin what he was actually experiencing, which was not anger at the investigation she had conducted or at the risk she had absorbed by conducting it alone, but something quieter and more particular, the realization that while he had been coming home each evening to what he believed was a shared and transparent life, she had been carrying a separate version of the last 6 weeks inside her, and the weight of it had been manageable enough that she had decided it was hers to carry rather than his to share. He told her he understood why she had reasoned her way to the conclusion she had reached. He told her the understanding was not the same as acceptance. He said she had taken from him the right to choose his own risk, that no one in a marriage of 11 years had the authority to make that decision unilaterally on behalf of their partner, and that what she had built inside their marriage without telling him was not a shelter but a wall, and he did not want to live on one side of a wall she had constructed to keep him safe. Marin listened without interrupting, and when she responded, she did not argue that her choice had been correct. She said she had been afraid of a specific thing, which was watching Elias do again what he had done in the year after Terrence died. The 8 months of technical requests and formal inquiries and meetings that led to closed doors. And then the particular way he had stopped, not because the question had been resolved, but because the cost of continuing had exceeded what he could absorb, and still come home at the end of the day and be present in the life they were building. She said she had watched him come back from that, slowly and at real cost, and she had not been willing to send him back into it before there was something solid waiting on the other side. Elias said that certainty was not hers to manage for him. She said she knew that now. She handed him her phone showing the complete communication thread with Julian. Every message, every document transfer, every meeting note she had kept, and gave him the passwords to the encrypted files she had stored off-site, laying the full record in front of him without editing, so he was receiving the actual version rather than a prepared one. He went through it methodically, and when he reached the serial number sequence in Terrence's notebook, he cross-referenced it against maintenance records he had memorized from his own work, and inside 20 minutes, he had traced a numeric chain linking the components. Terrence had documented to current inventory records across 17 aircraft in active commercial service. The thermal failure threshold in Terrence's data was a number Elias recognized. He had flagged it in a report 2 years earlier, in a document that had been reviewed, acknowledged, filed, and never acted upon. He called Naomi and asked to be listed as the primary technical witness in any federal proceeding. She asked if he understood what personal exposure that created. He said he understood exactly what it created. The company's communications team moved before sunrise. By 7 in the morning, a carefully framed account had reached the major outlets in Belhaven and the regional aviation press. A disgruntled senior engineer, a former general counsel with a documented legal history against the corporation, and an independent auditor who had allegedly exceeded her engagement scope, had together constructed a coordinated campaign against an institution employing 4,000 people with one of the strongest safety records in the regional aviation industry. The photograph anchoring the story came from a neighbor's security camera. Julian Cross walking from the front door of the Grant home to the Maybach, briefcase in hand, shot at an angle in the dark that made it look precisely like what Whitmore's communications office described it as: a covert meeting between a suspended engineer and a known corporate antagonist. It was a technically accurate description of a fundamentally misleading image, and Elias understood, as he looked at it on the kitchen laptop, that this was how an institution defended itself when the facts were not available for defense. You selected the facts that fit the frame you had already built and distributed them before the complete picture had time to form in the minds of the people receiving it. His colleagues mostly did not call. 2 engineers from the safety floor sent careful messages of support, worded carefully enough to mean very little if they were read by someone else. The bank that held the mortgage sent a form letter noting that his change in employment status had triggered a routine review of his loan terms. Preston appeared on a morning broadcast, looking composed and appropriately sorrowful, using the phrase "the Whitmore family" 4 times in 6 minutes, expressing hope that Elias would receive the support he needed, and never once using the word termination, saying instead administrative leave pending investigation, which was technically accurate and dishonest in every practical sense. The accusations the coverage carried ran 4 directions, each constructed carefully enough to suggest more than it stated. Elias had retained proprietary testing materials without authorization. Marin had accessed restricted financial systems under cover of a legitimate audit engagement. Julian Cross was pursuing a personal financial recovery through orchestrated reputation damage, and Terrence Grant, in the claim that landed most deliberately, had committed navigational errors consistent with fatigue and inadequate preparation, the kind of accusation designed to be unanswerable, because the person it was made against was not there to answer anything. Elias read that last item twice, and what he felt was not grief in the reactive sense, and not rage, but a very clean and very settled form of determination that does not require management because it has already resolved itself into a single direction of motion. Naomi told them in the afternoon meeting that the thermal chip data, the serial number documentation, and the financial flow map taken together constituted a credible foundation for a federal fraud investigation, and also told them that credible and sufficient were 2 different evidentiary standards, and that what remained missing was a direct documentary link between Preston Whitmore's decisions and the specific morning Terrence Grant had taken off in an aircraft carrying components that had already failed their extended operation thresholds. Julian's problem was structural. He had signed a legal document asserting that the accident investigation found no evidence of component failure, and every word of testimony he offered in contradiction of that document would arrive damaged. The moment Elias almost told Julian to leave was the moment he recognized, with uncomfortable precision, that Julian was a more expensive and more educated version of every engineer who had ever seen something seriously wrong inside a system, and decided the personal cost of saying so that day was too high to pay. He thought of what Terrence had written in the notebook's margin. The machine knows what it went through. Elias had been studying the disassembled actuator for 3 hours when he remembered something Terrence had told him years before, at Elias's kitchen table after a long shift, about the small thermal tracking chips that component manufacturers embedded in hydraulic and flight control hardware for warranty purposes. Chips designed to retain operating history, even if the surrounding housing failed, because the data they held was worth more to an insurance investigation than the component itself, and they were built accordingly. He found the chip behind the secondary housing bracket, the size of a thumbnail, intact after 4 years in a toolbox in a garage, because it had been engineered to survive conditions considerably worse than that. He had the data reading equipment in his home workshop, standard for a chief safety engineer, who regularly pulled operating data from returned components, and the log the chip produced was structured for clarity rather than complexity, date-stamped, sequential, recording the actuator's internal temperature at 15-second intervals across every operating cycle the device had ever run. The log recorded 6 test cycles. 3 of them stayed within the green operating band through their full duration. The 4th and 5th showed a gradual thermal ascent that crossed the safety threshold at the 47-minute mark and remained above it for the remainder of each run. The 6th was the flight that killed Terrence, and its log showed the actuator entering the critical thermal range at 43 minutes and reaching a temperature that, in Elias's professional assessment and in the explicit language of the component's own specification document, would have produced intermittent degradation of control response during extended final approach at low altitude. The exact phase of flight where degraded control response does not produce a warning before it produces a consequence. The timestamps on the log aligned with the official accident timeline in every publicly recorded detail, and contradicted the official cause determination in every detail that had ever mattered. Marin spent the same hours working through the financial records, building the complete path from North Star Dynamics backward, through its holding structure, and the endpoint was clear once the full architecture was assembled. A family trust registered under a Preston Whitmore charitable foundation receiving distributions from the Delaware investment vehicle Gavin Rourke administered. Funded by markup payments from a supplier that produced nothing, warehoused nothing, and employed exactly one person, a former Whitmore logistics coordinator who had separated from the company in the same quarter North Star was incorporated. When Naomi filed the evidence preservation order against Whitmore's server infrastructure, the company's legal team immediately filed a counter-motion, asserting national defense trade exemptions, requiring federal review before any internal technical documentation could be accessed. A maneuver designed to delay the proceeding by months. And it would have worked except that Naomi had anticipated it and framed the preservation request around financial records, which carried no defense exemption, and around the physical actuator, which was personal property delivered by postal mail to a private residential address and subject to no company claim. Preston convened an emergency board session for the following morning, a single item on the agenda: the accelerated sale of Whitmore's commercial component division to a European aerospace holding group, a transaction that, once completed, would relocate the relevant records to a jurisdiction outside the current proceeding and make recovery extremely difficult. Julian owned 4% of the outstanding shares, a remnant of his tenure as general counsel that the company had never successfully bought back at a price he was willing to accept, and he had a legal right to attend the board meeting. The night before they left for the session, someone placed a folded note under the wiper blade of Julian's Maybach. The canceled flight only bought you one more day. The board session was held in the Tower Conference Room on the 41st floor of Whitmore's Bellhaven headquarters. Long table, floor-to-ceiling glass. A city view designed to remind everyone present of the institutional scale in the room. And Preston opened with the resolution on the asset sale before pivoting. when Julian raised his shareholder objection directly to the argument he had clearly prepared, that Elias Grant had spent the previous 48 hours conducting a coordinated campaign of document theft and reputational damage against the company that had given him 11 years of career, that the allegations being circulated were driven by unresolved personal grief, and that the board had a fiduciary obligation to protect the institution from what he described as a weaponized private loss. Elias waited until Preston finished. He placed the disassembled actuator on the conference table and walked the room through the evidence without notes, because the material was his in the way that only deeply understood knowledge belongs to a person, not memorized for the occasion, but inhabited over years of work. He explained the serial number modification and what it required in terms of equipment and facility access. He described the specific thermal failure mode and its operational consequences in language a room of non-engineers could follow, because 11 years of translating technical findings into human consequence had made that translation automatic. He described the 6 cycles recorded on the chip log, the specific dates and temperatures, and what the data established about the flight on which Terrence died. He told the board that 17 commercial aircraft currently in active service were carrying actuators traceable to the same supply chain, and that the accumulated flight hours on those aircraft were approaching the duration at which the thermal failure pattern in Terrence's documentation became an operational risk rather than a historical one. Marin placed the financial map on the table, printed, annotated, structured so that the full flow from Whitmore subsidiary, accounts through North Star Dynamics to Gavin Rourke's investment vehicle, and then to the Whitmore Family Trust, was visible in a single connected sequence, with payment dates cross-referenced against the forged approval dates in a correlation that did not leave room for coincidence as a response. Julian stood and told the board what he had done and what he had failed to do, the post-accident legal document he had signed, the language he had used to close a file that should have remained open, and the years he had spent not returning calls from a federal investigator who had been trying to reach him. He said he had retained private counsel and intended to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, and that he understood his legal license was the probable price of doing so, and that he had decided the price was fair. Gavin Rourke told the board the procurement decisions had been made autonomously, without executive direction, a claim Marin immediately contradicted with printed email chains bearing Preston's personal address and approval notations in his own shorthand, authorizing the North Star budget line and, in one specific dated message, explicitly requiring the test program to continue on schedule, despite the technical review flag Terrence had formally submitted. Naomi Hartley and a federal team entered through the secondary conference room entrance with a lawful access warrant. The board chair moved to suspend Preston's executive authority pending independent review. The motion carried. The asset sale was blocked. Preston looked at Elias for a long moment before he spoke. He said that Elias had just destroyed a company that had supported thousands of families and generations of careers. Elias said, "No. You destroyed it when you decided human lives were a line item." The investigations moved at the pace federal proceedings against large corporations always move. Not slow by dysfunction, but slow by design, because the systems built to hold institutions accountable were made for endurance rather than speed. And both sides understood that time was a resource as much as evidence was. Preston Whitmore and Gavin Rourke were referred for prosecution on charges that included wire fraud, falsification of safety documentation, obstruction of a federal investigation, and violations of mandatory aviation safety disclosure requirements. Neither was immediately imprisoned, and neither walked away from what followed without consequence. The board retained outside counsel and an independent auditor, and began the process of remediation, which is a word that means correcting what should not have required correction. A different thing from making it right, though the two sometimes overlap. The 17 aircraft were grounded the morning after the board meeting, and the 3-month inspection that followed confirmed what the thermal data had already established, and the results were entered into the Federal Aviation Safety Record, without the confidentiality language that had been attached to Terrence's original accident file. The company issued a formal revision to the accident report. Precise legal language that reversed the conclusion which had absolved the components and placed the cause within the documented failure characteristics of the actuator series. Elias consulted with his mother and with Terrence's former partner before accepting the financial settlement and refusing the confidentiality clause, requesting instead that the revised accident determination be made a matter of permanent public record in the aviation safety database, where other engineers and investigators could find it. The board offered Elias an interim executive role while the restructuring proceeded, reasoning that someone needed to lead the engineering operation, and his was the most credible name available. He declined, explaining that replacing a corrupt executive with an honest one did not alter the structural conditions that had allowed the corruption to develop, and that what the organization needed was not a different person occupying the same position, but a different set of constraints around what that position was permitted to do unchecked. He accepted instead a newly created role, Director of Independent Safety Oversight, reporting directly to the board, with unilateral authority to suspend any aircraft program pending technical review without requiring executive approval. Julian Cross surrendered his legal license in the consent agreement he reached with the state bar, accepted a financial penalty, and agreed to supervised practice under restriction if the license was eventually restored. He had expected to feel relief when it was over, and he felt instead like a person who had set down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time, which is not the same as well, but is a condition from which functioning becomes possible again. Marin declined any compensation from Whitmore beyond the standard audit fee for her original engagement, and joined an advisory group developing whistleblower protection frameworks for regulated industries. She and Elias began meeting with a marriage counselor, not because the relationship had broken, but because they had both learned something about the way they each managed risk inside it, and they wanted to understand that pattern clearly enough not to reproduce it in a different form the next time the stakes required a decision. One evening in the third month, Elias went to the garage and placed Terrence's name badge, returned by the company as part of the personnel record restoration, beside the metal toolbox, and stood in the quiet for a while without needing to do anything else. 14 months after the night the Maybach appeared in his driveway, Elias Grant came home from a board oversight review to find the same car parked in the same spot. And this time he did not slow down at the curb or sit in the back of a cab, trying to determine what the car's presence signified. He walked directly to the front door, which Marin had left unlocked because she had seen him turn onto the street, and Julian was in the kitchen with a manila folder and a box of good tea, and Marin was already at the table with the documents open and facing Elias before he had fully entered the room. Not because Julian's presence required justification, but because the habit of transparency they had built into the house over the previous year meant she did not wait for him to ask. The folder contained the final court disposition and a letter from the Federal Aviation Authority confirming the permanent incorporation of Terrence's name into the Safety Research Center, that the restructured company had funded as a condition of its operating agreement. A room full of engineers working on problems that needed solving, named after the man who had identified one of those problems before anyone above him was willing to hear it, which was the kind of recognition that would have suited him. Elias set the folder on the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the Maybach sitting under the street lamp in the November dark, and what he felt was the specific quiet of a person standing in a life that has survived what it nearly did not survive. Not triumph or relief exactly, but the steady, present weight of having arrived at something that required him to stay honest about how he had gotten there. The canceled flight had sent him home early, into a house where something was already waiting for him, and the Maybach in the driveway had been the first signal. Not of the betrayal he had feared standing in the rain with a key in his hand, but of the moment when everything that mattered required him to stop moving forward on someone else's schedule and look carefully at what was already there.